There's a place on this earth with no fences, no deeds, no lines drawn across the ground to say, this is mine and that is yours. And yet, in that place, everyone knows exactly what belongs to whom. Tens of thousands of reindeer run free across a territory that spills across 4 countries. Not one of them is caged. Not one of them is leashed. But look closely at the ear of any single animal in that thundering herd, and you will find a small, deliberate cut, a signature older than any government stamp, telling you exactly which family it belongs to, and how many generations that family has carried this land in their blood. This is not a lost civilization buried under sand. This is not a legend you read about on a museum plaque. This is a people alive right now, at the coldest edge of Europe. And their story does not begin with a war, or a conquest, or a king. It begins with a question the modern world has almost forgotten how to ask. If no one owns the land, how does anyone survive on it? This is the story of the Sámi. Open a political map of Europe, and you'll find 4 names stitched across the top: Norway, Sweden, Finland, and a sliver of Russia. But ask a Sámi elder where they're from, and you may hear a name that appears on no passport in the world. Sápmi. Not a nation, not a territory recognized by the United Nations. Something older, and in some ways something stranger. A cultural homeland that existed long before Norway was Norway, before Sweden had a crown, before anyone thought to draw a border through the tundra at all. To an outsider, this might sound like a beautiful myth, the poetic idea of a people without borders. But to the Sámi, it isn't poetry. It's simply history. The lines on the map were drawn by someone else, centuries after the land already belonged to them. For most of history, the story of the Sámi was told by outsiders, missionaries, colonial officials, explorers passing through on their way to somewhere else. Then, in 1904, on a train somewhere in northern Scandinavia, a reindeer-herding wolf hunter named Johan Turi struck up a conversation with a young Danish art student named Emily de Mont Hatt. Neither spoke the other's language well. Through a translator, Turi told her he wanted, more than anything, to write a book about his people. She told him she wanted, more than anything, to live as a nomad. It sounds almost too neat to be true, and yet it happened exactly that way. 3 years later, having taught herself the Sámi language, de Mont Hatt returned north and moved in with Turi's family. By 1908, the 2 of them were living together in a mountain cabin, where she helped him shape his handwritten pages into a book. In 1910, that book was published, Muitalus Sámid Bira, the first work ever written and published in the Sámi language by a Sámi author. Turi wrote about childbirth, hunting, healing, Joik, folklore. Not as an anthropologist studying a foreign culture, but as a man writing about his own life. He hoped, quietly, that if the authorities finally understood who the Sámi really were, the harsh policies being forced upon his people might soften. The book would eventually be translated into roughly 10 languages. For the first time, the world was hearing about the Sámi not through the eyes of an outsider, but through the voice of one of their own. Most great civilizations leave behind a throne, a crown, a royal seal stamped in wax. Some object that says, unmistakably, this is power, and this is who holds it. The Sámi left behind none of these things. And yet, they built something arguably more elegant. A system of ownership so precise it needed no palace to enforce it. Every family, every bloodline, carries its own unique earmark, a specific pattern of cuts, registered and passed down through generations. No fence, no paperwork with an official stamp, just a glance at the shape of a notch on a single ear in a herd of thousands, and everyone instantly knows exactly whose animal it is. This single detail reveals something profound about how the Sámi understood ownership itself. You do not own the ground the animal stands on. You do not own the grass it eats, or the air it breathes. You only ever own the animal itself. Nothing more and nothing less. Picture a straight line drawn from the fjords of central Norway, east across Sweden's pine forests, further east through the frozen lake country of northern Finland, and further still until it disappears into the white silence of Russia's Kola Peninsula. That entire distance, thousands of kilometers of tundra, mountain, and forest, is Sápmi. Laid side by side, it would swallow several European countries whole. Borders and all. This is one of the oldest, continuously living indigenous cultures on the European continent, and it has survived across some of the harshest terrain the continent has to offer. A land where winter can bury half the year in darkness, where for weeks at a time the sun simply doesn't bother to rise, and months later refuses to set at all, hanging low and orange over the horizon at 2 a.m. No empire ever truly conquered the whole of Sápmi, the way empires conquer land elsewhere. Not the Vikings, not the Nordic kingdoms that came after them. There was simply nothing fixed to seize. No capital to burn, no palace to occupy. No single village that, once taken, meant the war was won. A people who are always moving are, by nature, extraordinarily difficult to pin down with a map or a sword. Here is the detail that tends to stop people mid-sentence. The Sámi do not lead the reindeer. The reindeer lead them. The animals feed on lichen, a slow-growing moss clinging to rock and tree bark. And when one patch is exhausted, the herd simply moves on, following an instinct older than any human calendar. The Sámi do not impose a route. They read the land through the animal, and they follow. Because of this, the Sámi never adopted a fixed 12-month calendar, the way most of the world did. Instead, they kept an 8-season calendar, marked not by dates, but by the reindeer's biological rhythm. The season of calving, the season of migration into the mountains, the season antlers are shed, the mating season, and the long migration back toward the coast to escape the deepest cold. It is worth pausing on that for a moment. An entire civilization organizing its sense of time not around the number on a page, but around the breathing pattern of another species. Today, that way of life has narrowed. Only around 1 in 10 Sámi, a few thousand people scattered across 4 countries, still herd reindeer as a daily occupation. In many regions, the right to herd is legally reserved exclusively for Sámi people, precisely because it stopped being merely a job a long time ago. It became something closer to a language the body still remembers, even after the mind has moved to the city. If other civilizations left their language painted onto temple walls, the Sámi wrote theirs directly onto the clothes they wore every single day, the gachti. Deep indigo blue as the base, bands of fierce red circling the collar, the cuffs, the hem. But this is no random ornamentation. Every color, every pattern, every way the belt is tied carries information. Which region of Sápmi the wearer comes from, which family they belong to, sometimes even whether they are married. Unlike so many traditional garments that survive only in festival photographs, the gachti is still worn in ordinary daily life by many Sámi families, particularly reindeer herding communities. And especially on days that matter, like Sámi National Day on February 6th, or Norway's Constitution Day on May 17th, when it becomes something closer to a quiet, wordless declaration. I am still here. Picture a father sitting by firelight, slowly turning a piece of reindeer antler over in his hands, deciding where the first cut should go. There is no pattern pinned to the wall, no instructor watching over his shoulder, just years of memory in his fingers, telling him what the bone wants to become. The Sámi call this duoji, traditional handicraft, but calling it art in the way a museum uses that word misses something essential. Duoji was never separate from daily survival. It was daily survival, shaped into something beautiful, almost as an afterthought. From antler and bone, birch bark, silver and pewter, Sámi hands shaped hunting knives etched with looping traditional motifs. Drinking cups carved to fit a single palm. Jewelry passed down like small inherited secrets. A Sámi knife was never only a tool. It was a signature. The way a person carved their own blade quietly revealed their skill, their taste, and their place within the community, long before they said a single word. None of this was ever taught in a classroom. It moved from father to son, from mother to daughter, through years of simply watching and being allowed, slowly, to try. An apprenticeship with no diploma at the end of it. Only the day someone finally looks at what you've made and says nothing, because nothing needs to be said. Before Christianity arrived in the north, the Sámi spiritual world revolved around the spirits of nature, the spirit of snow, the spirit of wind, the spirit of the tree. And one central figure known as the Noaiti, often translated as shaman or sorcerer, though neither word quite captures the role. The Noaidi was not only a spiritual leader, they were the community's healer, using moss, algae, and Arctic herbs to treat illness. Spiritually, the Sámi believed the Noaidi could summon souls, rouse the dying, and even hold death at bay. Through the sound of a sacred ritual drum called the Runebommen. That drum was more than an instrument. It was a miniature map of the universe. Its surface painted with symbols: the sun, the spirits, animals, the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. When the Noaidi struck the drum and slipped into trance, the Sámi believed the Noaidi's spirit could travel between those worlds, searching for answers on behalf of everyone left waiting by the fire. This is where the story turns. Quietly, and then all at once, toward darkness. As Christian missionaries pushed deeper into Sápmi through the 17th and 18th centuries, the Runebommen, the most sacred object in Sámi spiritual life, was branded as a tool of sorcery, of paganism, of everything the church had come to fear. Drums were confiscated by the hundreds. A great many were burned in public, part punishment, part warning to anyone still holding on to the old ways. Alongside the drum, Joik, the ancient vocal art in which a melody is not a song about a person or an animal, but is believed to be that person or animal translated into sound, was banned in many places too, including inside schoolrooms, for generations that followed. How many of the original ritual drums survive today, anywhere in the world? The number lands somewhere around 70. 70 drums, out of what was once thousands, spread thin now across museum collections in Stockholm, Oslo, Copenhagen, most of them behind glass, catalogued, studied, admired by tourists who have no idea what they're looking at. An entire spiritual framework that once sustained a people for centuries, and what's left of it could fit inside a single room. Try to imagine the coldest night you have ever felt. Now take away the walls. Take away the heating. Take away the certainty that help is a phone call away. What's left is an ordinary Tuesday in traditional Sámi life. And somehow it worked for thousands of years. If any people on Earth deserve the title of masters of Arctic survival, it is the Sámi. Not because they had special tools nobody else had, because they had no room. None at all, for anyone in the group to be a specialist. A grown man was expected to herd the animals, slaughter them, butcher the meat, smoke it over a low fire until it would keep for months, tan the hide until it was soft enough to wear, and raise a lavu, that cone-shaped tent an experienced family could pitch, fully livable, wind-braced against an Arctic storm, in under 2 hours. When it was time to move, they could take it all down again just as fast, leaving behind nothing but flattened grass. A knife at the hip was never a weapon of choice. It cut rope, it skinned an animal, it shaved kindling for a fire. It settled an argument about whose turn it was to do the dishes. The Arctic tundra has no patience for narrow expertise, and even less for fragility. It demands that a person know how to do almost everything on almost no notice. And Sámi women carried every bit of that same competence as the men, out of necessity, not exception. Here is a puzzle that has quietly bothered linguists for well over a century, and still has no clean answer. Stand a Norwegian, a Swede, and a Sámi elder side by side, and their languages should, by every rule of geography, sound at least a little related. They've shared the same mountains, the same coastlines, the same brutal winters for thousands of years. And yet, the Sámi languages belong to something else entirely, the Uralic family, a lineage with no relation whatsoever to Norwegian, Swedish, or any Germanic tongue spoken around them. Linguistically, the Sámi are, in a sense, strangers in their own neighborhood, closer kin to languages spoken far to the east, near Russia's Ural Mountains, than to the very people they've lived beside for millennia. For a long time, scholars had a tidy explanation. Sámi and Finnish, they assumed, grew from the same ancestral branch. Case closed. But the more closely linguists have looked, the less tidy that explanation has become. Many now suspect the resemblance between the two is simply the residue of centuries of neighbors borrowing words from each other, not proof of a shared origin at all. So the question sits there, unresolved. Where did the ancestors of the Sámi actually come from? And by what quiet stubbornness did their language survive, fully intact, for thousands of years, floating like an island in a sea of Germanic speech that surrounded it on every side? No one has yet produced an answer that the whole field agrees on, which means somewhere in that question, there is still a piece of Sámi history that hasn't been written yet. If the burning of the drums was a single wound, what followed from the late 19th century into the mid-20th was something closer to a slow, deliberate erasure. Norway called its version Norwegianization. Sámi children were taken from their families and placed in boarding schools, where speaking their own mother tongue, inside the very walls meant to educate them, was forbidden. They were taught, not as a side effect, but as the point, to feel ashamed of where they came from. Sweden and Finland ran policies that looked almost identical, just filed under different names. Think about what that actually does to a person, over one lifetime, let alone several. A child punished for the language their grandmother sang to them. A teenager who learns, slowly, that the safest thing to do is stop mentioning where their family is from. Many of that grandparents' generation chose silence, not out of shame in their hearts, but as a survival strategy in a world that had made their identity dangerous to speak aloud. The language itself came within a generation, maybe two, of disappearing entirely. And then, as if history needed to add one more blow, in 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, unfolding thousands of kilometers away in a country most Sámi had never set foot in, sent radioactive fallout drifting north on the wind, settling into the lichen that reindeer herds had fed on for thousands of years. Entire herds had to be destroyed. A way of life already bent nearly to breaking point absorbed one more blow it never saw coming. On February 6, 1917, in the Norwegian city of Trondheim, Sámi representatives from different regions, who until that point had virtually no formal way of communicating across the borders now cutting through their homeland, gathered for the very first time in a shared assembly, to speak collectively in defense of their own rights. No weapons, no army, just people who had decided, together, that silence was no longer an option. That day would later become Sámi National Day, still celebrated every year by Sámi communities across all 4 countries. It was a modest beginning, but it was the first thread of a movement towards self-determination that would take more than a century to unfold. Starting in the 1970s, something began to shift. The wider world finally started learning about the Sámi through literature and music, not filtered through a missionary's account or a colonial official's report, but voiced directly by Sámi artists themselves, in their own words, on their own terms. Joik led the way. The sound once banned from classrooms, once condemned from church pulpits as something close to sin, is today recognized as intangible cultural heritage. Sámi artist Mari Boyne took that ancient throat song and wove it into contemporary music, carrying it far past the borders of Sápmi to audiences who had never even heard the word before. The Runebommen followed a similar arc in its own quieter way. The very drums once burned by the hundreds are now studied, restored, and displayed as treasures in museums across the Nordic countries. The same institutions that once justified their destruction, now working to bring the surviving ones home. And somewhere at the root of all of it sits a single mountain cabin from more than a century ago, where a reindeer herder and a Danish art student once sat hunched over handwritten pages by lamplight. Johan Turi's book, once the lonely effort of one man hoping the world would finally understand his people, is now taught as a classic, still being reprinted more than 100 years after the ink first dried. Today, the Sámi have their own Sámi parliaments. Norway's opened its doors in 1989. Sweden's followed in 1993. Finland's in 1996. Not sovereign governments, not nations within nations, but official representative bodies with a genuine voice in matters of land, education, and culture. Sitting in buildings the Sámi themselves designed, on ground they no longer have to ask permission to stand on. They fly their own flag, carrying the same colors found on the gakti for generations. In parts of northern Norway and Finland, schools now teach bilingually, working to save a language that nearly vanished within living memory. But not everything has been resolved neatly. Many young Sámi still leave their homeland for the cities, for universities, for lives that have little to do with reindeer or lavu tents. The question of how to hold on to identity inside an increasingly urban world remains genuinely open. And yet, here is something worth sitting with. A great many of those young people, even after leaving, are learning the Sámi language again. They still put on the gakti for the days that matter. They still return to Sápmi every summer without fail. For them, identity is no longer tied to one fixed way of living. It has become something they simply carry with them, wherever life happens to take them next. And that, in the end, is the answer to the question this story opened with. You don't need to own a place to belong to it. You only need to carry it with you.